Hello, interweb world. This is Wild Lee of Wild Fempire, and I am stepping into this Moonday Live with a curiosity around how we continue to move forward, feeling our feelings and providing ourselves care and regulation when the systems and structures outside of ourselves are disappointing us or not showing up in the ways that we would prefer. And of course, I'm referencing here the Supreme Court decision that we received last week. And mm, it feels really important to start off by saying, like, all of our feelings are valid, right? Everything that we're feeling, everything that we're experiencing is so valid. And my curiosity that I'm stepping into this morning with, or this afternoon rather, is how do we navigate and process these really big, beautiful feelings? How do we continue moving forward in the invitation of progress that we want to see in our communities and in our countries? How do we do that from a different energy, from a different space? It feels really true to me in my body that meeting this type of violence, and it feels like violence to me to remove body autonomy from people. But meeting that with more violence doesn't feel sustainable, nor does it feel like a way in which we are going to step into power with dynamics instead of power over hierarchy, which is what we're seeing right now, right? Like, we're really just seeing empire doing what empire does. And I don't have all the answers. I don't claim to know what the answer is, but I'm curious. I'm curious about having this conversation, and I'm curious about opening ourselves to an even deeper understanding of the complexity and nuance of this experience that we're moving through, right? If you've been following me for a while, you know one of the things that I say a lot is both and, right? Life is nuanced. This topic is nuanced. You can believe in body autonomy for all humans, for all women, and still not prefer abortion, right? Like, we have the capability and the complexity of holding both of these sensations in our body. So I'm curious, how does humanity begin to elevate ourselves to a space where we can have these conversations without othering one another? How can we have these conversations respectfully without removing each other's right to body autonomy? How do we step into the space of having our big feelings and learning how to process and regulate rather than immediately projecting those feelings onto the other, the person that we have decided is the enemy or is the person that is in the wrong? And I'm making no value judgments or value statements. I personally believe that women should, of course, have the autonomy over their bodies that they desire to have. And I can understand why people are turned off by the idea of abortion. Both sides hold truth to them. And and the big both and. How do we regulate to holding those truths in our bodies without splashing all of our discomfort and confusion and creating more strife and discontent in our communities and in our countries? Is it possible that these types of issues that are so polarized and so aggravating are distracting us from actually seeing the trajectory of our political systems? Are they actively distracting us from other things that may hold an even longer term effect on our communities and on our children? I don't know. I'm just really curious. I'm really curious. And what feels true to me in my body in this now moment is that it begins with each one of us really getting centered into our own bodies, into our own sovereignty, into our own sensation of truth, and finding our feet before we begin engaging with other people, engaging with those around us. It means doubling and tripling our self care so that we can be regulated in these feeling bodies that have all of these feelings for good reason, right? How do we do that? How do we begin to regulate? If you have specific ways that you regulate that you'd like to add in the chat, I would love to know. For myself, it begins with turning off screens, begins with quiet time, salt baths, drinking lots of water. I tend to want to lie on the floor a lot, get really low, get really grounded. I personally need to cuddle a lot, so I cuddle my animals a lot, cuddle my partner. I get in the sunshine more. That warmth really supports my nervous system and softening. I body oil. I've body oiled every day since that decision was released to the public. Yeah, I just want to center the conversation on really bringing ourselves back to ourselves. We're all increasing our capacity to hold a lot of information about the world around us. And it begins first with really centering ourselves, learning how to regulate our own personal nervous system, coming into that space of homeostasis so that we can actively have these conversations, these nuanced conversations from that place of groundedness instead of a disempowered place of feeling as though we have to fight to be heard or fight to have our needs met. I know that is the first place that I wanted to go to. I know that that is valid and real. That fire in the belly for change is an incredibly real state. But I also know that that is not necessarily the state that's going to actively shift our communities and our country to what we want it to be. There's that nuance. How do we take that fire in the belly, stoke that fire, get that fire really hot, and then allow it to fuel us with sustainability for the long haul so that we are utilizing our energy in a way that is going to last and not burn us out and not create a chain reaction of activations that may very well create a backlash of momentum that doesn't serve our cause at all, right? And I know I know this is not what a lot of people want to hear, but meeting something as big as what this decision has been, as what it means for female bodied humans in this country, meeting it with the same vitriol and hatefulness isn't going to progress our goal. That type of expression gets turned around and used against us and against the progress that we are envisioning. What feels true in my body, what feels true in my conduit is that we're being invited to hold that fire in the belly and to use it to fuel a sustainable, peaceful progress. We can't meet empire with empire's tactics. It just doesn't work. It just creates more tension, more agitation, more enemies. It just creates an othering that keeps the narrative going. I don't want to live in a world where I feel pitted against men over reproductive rights. I want to invite and include men in the conversation that affects both of us and takes both parties to create those babies. And I say this while still feeling a fire in my belly of rage. Like, I still feel rage in my body. I am still angry as fuck. And I want to embody and walk the talk of regulating my feelings, processing them, moving them through, finding connection, finding community, and bringing forward the message that I am unwilling to other. I'm just unwilling to do that. We've seen over the course of the last few years too many opportunities to other and divide us from one another. And another thing I've seen is that I have a lot more in common with different groups of people than I thought I did. That was one miraculous gift of COVID, is that I began to see that I have values in common with all sorts of different groups of people. I began to think that, oh, maybe I actually have more in common with the vast majority of people than I do have in opposition. And I began to get this sensation that perhaps those few things that we might have in common are actually these old wounds that get nitpicked and agitated when the people in power want to keep us distracted from what's actually happening in the political systems that are operating and driving this empire forward. And I don't want to be a pawn in that game anymore. Even as I feel rage, even as I feel anger, even as the old version of me is tickling my subconscious and wants to come forward and just start yelling and marching and protesting. And I probably will march and protest, but I want to bring a different energy to those types of experiences. I don't want to add to the noise and the confusion and the agitation. I want to show up in this social experience as the divine magnetic, the invitation to nuance, the invitation of both and. I want to show up in that energy because that's the only type of energy that is going to really, truly change these types of conversations. Is if we can show up in nonviolence and really listen to one another from a place of I agree to disagree. And I think that is the piece that is really missing in these conversations, in these places where value systems simply don't agree. We've been taught that we have to convince one another, we have to control one another, that there are only two choices. We've been force fed this concept of the binary in all ways, and that the only way for our personal value system to be validated or authenticated is if we get everyone on board. And that's such an immature way to proceed through life. It doesn't give any space for nuance. It doesn't give any space for other people's lived experiences. And I don't have all of the answers, but I am curious what would happen if we just accepted that, yeah, it's uncomfortable and sad to consider an abortion, the ending of a life. And it's also uncomfortable and sad to consider a woman being forced to carry a child to term and then traumatizing that child through the adoption process or through neglecting that child because it's an unwanted child. Like, all of these things can be true at the same time. All of these possibilities can be true. Can we collectively, as a society, begin to elevate ourselves above this idea of needing to fight for truth and instead accepting that truth is multidimensional, multifaceted, and our version of truth is only one tiny pinprick, just a little spark of the vastness that truth is. And it takes all of our sparks to make this juicy life, this wonderful reality that we're experiencing. And it will take all of us making a commitment to self regulation, making a commitment to invitation rather than empire and power over and violence. And this isn't the easy answer. It's not the answer that we've been taught. And it's one that requires a vast amount of courage because it is not the norm. And it will breed dissonance until people feel the vibe, until people really feel that frequency of inclusion and the invitation that we can all respect one another without having to agree with one another. Hmm. Yeah, that feels like the transmission for this moon day. I'm so curious to hear and feel how this lands for you. I'm curious to have this conversation. I'm curious to know how you are choosing to regulate and to be in community, in witness, and being witnessed in the regulation process. There's, of course, no ignoring or suppressing or bypassing the feelings. They're here, they're real. We need to feel the fuck out of them. And how do we operate beyond? What's the next step after feeling the feelings? How do we come together and rise up in a way that doesn't meet empire with the same energy? How do we really lean into the divine feminine, the divine magnetic? How do we truly use our superpower as a way to change the world instead of trying to meet toxic electric energy with more of the same. I'm so curious. Let me know how this lands for you. And until next week, take good care. I'll tune in with you again soon.